Part 1. Welcome back to the Slumbering Musicologist. I'm grateful you've returned for another journey through the vast landscape of music history. Tonight, we travel to ancient Greece, to a world where music was not merely entertainment, but a fundamental force shaping the cosmos, the soul, and society itself. In the previous episodes, we've explored the musical worlds of Mesopotamia and Egypt, civilizations that gave us the earliest instruments and songs. Now we arrive at a culture that would transform how humanity thought about music forever. The ancient Greeks didn't just make music, they theorized about it, systematized it, and elevated it to a philosophical principle that would echo through the centuries. Over the coming time together, we'll discover a civilization that believed music could heal the sick, educate the young, and even influence the movements of the stars. We'll encounter the lyre and the aulos, instruments whose sounds filled theaters and temples. We'll meet poets and philosophers who wrote treatises on musical modes, who debated the ethical power of different scales, who saw in music a mirror of the universe itself. The music of ancient Greece comes to us through fragments, through pottery paintings, through philosophical texts, through later Roman descriptions. Yet from these scattered pieces, we can reconstruct a rich musical culture that valued this art above almost all others. Music was present at births and deaths, at weddings and funerals, at festivals and wars, at private symposia and public contests. Tonight, as you settle into rest, allow yourself to be transported to the sunlit slopes of Mount Parnassus, to the marble steps of the Theater of Dionysus, to the halls of the Lyceum where Aristotle taught. Listen for the plucked strings of the kithara, the reedy voice of the aulos, the choral voices raised in praise of gods and heroes. If you find these journeys through music history helpful for rest, consider subscribing to this channel. New episodes arrive every Friday at 6 p.m. GMT, each one exploring a different chapter in humanity's musical story. Leave the video playing as you drift off, and let the gentle pace of historical narrative carry you into peaceful sleep. To understand Greek music, we must first understand the Greek world itself. The civilization we call ancient Greece was not a unified nation, but a collection of city-states, each with its own character, spread across the Mediterranean from southern Italy to the coast of Asia Minor. These city-states shared a common language, common gods, and a common understanding that music was essential to civilized life. The period we'll explore tonight spans roughly from the 8th century before Christ to the 4th century before Christ, though Greek musical culture extended both before and after these boundaries. This is the era of Homer and Hesiod, of Sappho and Pindar, of Aeschylus and Sophocles, of Plato and Aristotle. It's the age when Athens built the Parthenon, when Sparta trained its warriors, when Alexander the Great carried Greek culture to the edges of the known world. Greek society was organized around the polis, the city-state, and music played a role in almost every aspect of polis life. Children learned music as part of their basic education, alongside reading, writing, and physical training. The Greeks believed that musical training shaped character, that different modes and rhythms could make a person brave or cowardly, temperate or licentious. This was not metaphorical. They truly believed in the ethical power of music. Religious festivals dominated the Greek calendar, and music dominated religious festivals. 4 times each year, Athens held dramatic competitions in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. Tragedies and comedies were not spoken but sung, with choruses dancing and chanting in elaborate formations. The winning playwrights became celebrities, their works copied and performed throughout the Greek world. Athletic competitions, too, featured music prominently. At the Olympic Games, trumpeters announced events and heralds proclaimed victors. But there were also purely musical competitions, the Pythian Games at Delphi being the most prestigious. Here, musicians competed on the kithara and aulos, demonstrating their virtuosity before critical audiences. Winners received crowns of laurel and fame that spread across the Greek world. Private life, too, was filled with music. At the symposium, that uniquely Greek institution where men gathered to drink wine and engage in intellectual discourse, music provided both entertainment and structure. Guests took turns singing songs, often improvising new verses to familiar melodies. Professional musicians, both male and female, might be hired to perform. The Greeks drank their wine mixed with water, and the proportion of the mixture was determined by the symposiarch, the master of ceremonies, who might also set rules about what songs could be performed. The Greeks did not separate music from poetry. The word music derives from the Muses, the 9 goddesses who inspired all creative arts. Lyric poetry was poetry sung to the lyre. Tragic and comic poetry were sung and danced in the theater. Even epic poetry, the long narratives of Homer and Hesiod, were chanted to simple melodies, with the bard accompanying himself on the pharynx, an early form of lyre. Dance, too, was inseparable from music in the Greek mind. The word chorus originally meant a group of dancers. In the theater, the chorus both sang and moved in intricate patterns, called strophes and antistrophes, their steps as carefully choreographed as their melodies. Different types of dance corresponded to different social occasions: the solemn Emilia for tragedy, the lively Cordax for comedy, the martial Pyrrhic for military training. The Greeks organized sound according to theoretical principles that would influence Western music for millennia. They recognized the octave as a fundamental interval, the point at which a pitch repeats at a higher level. They divided this octave into smaller intervals, creating scales called modes, each with its own character and ethical associations. The Dorian mode was thought to promote courage and steadfastness. The Phrygian mode inspired religious ecstasy. The Lydian mode was associated with softness and luxury, sometimes even criticized as effeminate and corrupting. These modes were not merely abstract theory. They were living musical practice, used by composers and performers to achieve specific emotional effects. A poet writing a wedding song would choose the Mixolydian mode for its joyful character. A tragic playwright depicting a hero's downfall might employ the mournful Hypodorian. The choice of mode was as important as the choice of words. Musical instruments in ancient Greece fell into several categories. String instruments included the lyre, a simple instrument with 7 strings stretched across a soundbox made from tortoiseshell, played by plucking with a plectrum or the fingers. The kithara was a more elaborate wooden lyre, the instrument of professional musicians, capable of greater volume and complexity. The barbitos was an elongated lyre with a deeper tone, favored at symposia. Wind instruments were dominated by the aulos, which Greeks themselves classified as a reed instrument rather than a flute. The aulos actually consisted of 2 pipes played simultaneously, each with a double reed similar to a modern oboe. The sound was penetrating and intense, associated with Dionysus, and often considered more emotionally raw than the civilized lyre, which was associated with Apollo. Some philosophers worried about the aulos' power to overwhelm reason with passion. Percussion instruments provided rhythm. The tympanon, a frame drum, accompanied ecstatic religious rites. The crotala, similar to castanets, marked time for dancers. The hydraulis, or water organ, was a later Greek invention, using water pressure to force air through pipes, producing sustained tones that earlier instruments could not achieve. The Greeks left us no complete musical scores in the modern sense. Musical notation existed, but was rare and difficult to interpret. Most music was transmitted orally, learned by ear and memory, passed from teacher to student across generations. This oral tradition meant that Greek music was constantly evolving, with each performer adding subtle variations, each generation developing new styles. What survives to us are fragments. About 50 pieces of Greek music exist in ancient notation, most of them incomplete, many of them from the later Hellenistic and Roman periods when Greek musical practice was already changing. The most substantial surviving piece is a hymn to Apollo from Delphi, dating to around 130 before Christ, carved in stone on the walls of the Athenian treasury. Other fragments come from papyri found in Egypt, from gravestones bearing epitaphs in musical notation, from philosophical treatises that included musical examples. These fragments, precious as they are, cannot fully convey the sound world of classical Greece. We know what notes were played, but not always the rhythm, the tempo, the dynamics, the timbre. We don't hear the particular qualities of ancient instruments, made with ancient materials and techniques. We can't experience the acoustic environments, the way music sounded in open-air theaters seating thousands, or in the intimate setting of a private andron with walls draped in textiles. Yet we have something perhaps more valuable, the Greeks' own writings about music. Plato and Aristotle both wrote extensively on music's role in education and society. Aristoxenus, a student of Aristotle, wrote treatises on rhythm and melody that preserve detailed information about musical practice. Ptolemy, though he lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, codified earlier Greek music theory in his Harmonics. From these texts, we can reconstruct the theoretical frameworks, the aesthetic values, the social meanings that gave Greek music its power. As we continue tonight, we'll explore these themes in greater depth. We'll meet the musicians and poets who created this tradition. We'll examine the instruments they played and the theories they developed. We'll discover how music functioned in Greek society, how it shaped Greek thought, how it continues to influence Western music to this day. Part 2. The musicians of ancient Greece came from diverse backgrounds and enjoyed varying degrees of social status. In the Archaic period, during the 8th and 7th centuries, before Christ, poets were often aristocrats who composed for their own pleasure and that of their peers. In the Classical period, during the 5th and 4th centuries, before Christ, professional musicians emerged, some achieving great fame and wealth, others working as hired entertainers with little social prestige. Let us begin with Terpander, a semi-legendary figure from the 7th century before Christ, credited with revolutionizing Greek music. Ancient sources say Terpander came from the island of Lesbos and won the first musical competition at the Carneia festival in Sparta around 676 before Christ. Whether these specific details are accurate, Terpander represents an important transition in Greek musical history. Before Terpander, according to tradition, the lyre had only 4 strings. Terpander is said to have added 3 more, bringing the number to 7, the standard for classical Greek lyres. This expansion allowed for greater melodic range and complexity. Terpander also established the nome, a traditional form for musical composition, particularly for pieces accompanying solo singing. His innovations influenced generations of musicians who followed. Terpander reportedly traveled widely, bringing musical culture to different Greek cities. The Spartans, who later became known for their military austerity, invited Terpander to their city during a period of civil strife. Music, they believed, could restore social harmony and order. This faith in music's civilizing power was fundamental to Greek thought. They saw music not as mere entertainment, but as a force that shaped the soul and therefore society itself. Moving forward in time, we encounter the lyric poets of the 6th century before Christ, whose verses were indeed meant to be sung to the lyre. Sappho of Lesbos stands as one of the greatest poets in any language, though only fragments of her work survive. Born around 620 before Christ, Sappho lived on Lesbos, possibly leading a circle of young women devoted to poetry and music. Sappho's poems were intimate and personal, often addressing love and desire with unprecedented directness and emotional intensity. She wrote in the Aeolic dialect of Lesbos, her verses structured in complex meters that matched specific melodies. The Greeks recognized 9 canonical lyric poets, and Sappho was the only woman among them, indicating the high regard in which her contemporaries held her work. We cannot hear Sappho's music. We have her words, or some of them, preserved by later anthologists who valued the poetry but had no means to record the melodies. Yet her poems themselves speak of music. She describes the lyre, the pleasing sounds of the kithara, the songs of nightingales, Music permeates her world, inseparable from poetry, from emotion, from life itself. Another significant poet-musician was Alcaeus, also from Lesbos, a contemporary and possibly a rival of Sappho. Where Sappho's poetry was personal and passionate, Alcaeus wrote about politics, war, and the symposium. His drinking songs established a tradition that would continue throughout Greek and later Roman culture. At symposia, men sang Alcaeus's verses, celebrating friendship, lamenting exile, praising heroic virtues. Anacreon of Teos, who lived during the late 6th century before Christ, became famous for his light, elegant poems about wine, love, and the pleasures of life. Unlike Sappho and Alcaeus, who were aristocrats singing for their peers, Anacreon was a professional poet who traveled from court to court, patronized by tyrants and wealthy aristocrats. He spent time in Samos at the court of Polycrates, later moving to Athens at the invitation of Hipparchus, son of the tyrant Pisistratus. Anacreon's career illustrates the changing status of musicians in Greek society. By the late 6th century, before Christ, music was becoming professionalized. Talented musicians could make a living from their art, though they sacrificed the social prestige of the aristocratic amateur. This tension between amateur and professional, between music as aristocratic leisure and music as paid work, would persist throughout Greek history. The 5th century before Christ, the classical period, saw the flourishing of choral lyric poetry, complex musical compositions for choruses of singers and dancers. Pindar of Thebes, born around 518 before Christ, was the greatest master of this form. His victory odes, commissioned by wealthy patrons to celebrate athletic triumphs at the Olympic and other games, combined elaborate mythological narratives with praise of the victors. Pindar's odes were performed by choruses of young men or boys, accompanied by the lyre or aulos, with choreographed movements. The structure reflected this performative origin: strophe, antistrophe, and dipode, corresponding to the chorus's movements across the orchestra, the circular dancing area. The strophe was sung while the chorus moved in one direction, the antistrophe while they reversed direction, the epode while they stood still. Pindar's language was elevated and complex, his references to mythology extensive and elusive. He saw the poet as a craftsman, music as a skilled craft requiring years of training. He frequently used architectural metaphors, describing his odes as buildings constructed with artistic precision. For Pindar, music was not spontaneous emotion but disciplined art, the product of inspiration guided by technique. Another important choral poet was Bacchylides, a nephew of the earlier poet Simonides. Bacchylides, like Pindar, wrote victory odes and dithyrambs, hymns to Dionysus performed by circular choruses of 50. His style was clearer and simpler than Pindar's, his narratives more straightforward, making his work more accessible to audiences. Long-lost, substantial portions of Bacchylides' poetry were recovered in 1896 from Egyptian papyri, suddenly illuminating a major poet known previously only from fragments. In the theater, music reached its most elaborate form. The three great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, were also composers, creating both the words and the music for their plays. Tragedy, as it developed in Athens during the 5th century before Christ, was fundamentally musical drama. The actors sang their parts, the chorus sang and danced. Only occasional dialogue was spoken without melody. Aeschylus, the earliest of the three, who lived from approximately 525 to 456 before Christ, emphasized the chorus, giving it a central role in his dramas. His choruses were large, 50 members in some cases, their singing and movement constituting much of the performance. Aeschylus himself had performed as an actor and knew the power of theatrical music to move audiences emotionally. Sophocles, who lived from approximately 497 to 406 before Christ, made the chorus smaller, but no less important musically. His plays balanced choral odes with scenes of actors' dialogue, creating dramatic structures that would influence theater for centuries. Sophocles was also known as a musician outside the theater, reportedly performing at a symposium celebrating the Athenian victory over the Persians at Salamis in 480 before Christ. Euripides, the youngest of the three, who lived from approximately 480 to 406 before Christ, was controversial in his own time, partly because of his innovative approach to music. He composed more complex, chromatic melodies, moving away from the traditional modes, introducing foreign musical elements from other cultures. Conservative critics accused him of corrupting Greek music, though modern scholars see him as expanding musical possibilities, exploring new expressive territories. The comedian Aristophanes, who lived from approximately 446 to approximately 386 before Christ, satirized Euripides' musical innovations in his play, The Frogs, staged in 405 before Christ. In this comedy, Dionysus descends to the underworld to bring back a tragic poet, ultimately choosing Aeschylus over Euripides. The play includes parodies of both poets' styles, with Aeschylus representing traditional, noble music, and Euripides representing modern, over-elaborate compositions. Even in mockery, Aristophanes testifies to music's importance in Athenian culture and the passionate debates about musical style. Professional musicians, distinct from the poet-composers, also achieved fame in classical Greece. Timotheus of Miletus, who lived from approximately 450 to 360 before Christ, was a virtuoso citharode, meaning a singer who accompanied himself on the kithara. He expanded the kithara from 7 strings to 11, allowing for greater harmonic complexity and more elaborate melodic passages. Conservative critics condemned this innovation as excessive and corrupting, but Timotheus defended himself, arguing that innovation was essential to artistic progress. Female musicians occupied a complex position in Greek society. Respectable women were generally excluded from public musical performance, though they participated in religious choruses and private music making. Professional female musicians were often slaves or foreigners, performing at symposia and other male gatherings. Some achieved considerable fame and wealth. Lamia, a courtesan and aulos player, became the lover of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's successors who ruled Egypt, wielding significant political influence through their relationship. Greek music was monophonic, meaning it consisted of a single melodic line without harmony in the modern sense. When instruments accompanied singing, they either played the same melody as the voice, perhaps with some ornamentation, or they played before and after the sung portions while the singer rested. The concept of multiple independent melodic lines, sounding simultaneously, which would later become central to Western music, did not exist in ancient Greece. The fundamental unit of Greek music was the tetrachord, a series of 4 notes spanning the interval we call a perfect fourth. 2 tetrachords joined together created a scale spanning an octave. The top and bottom notes of each tetrachord were fixed, while the 2 middle notes could vary, creating different genera, different ways of dividing the tetrachord's internal space. The 3 genera were diatonic, chromatic, and enharmonic. The diatonic genus placed the 2 movable notes to create intervals similar to the whole steps and half steps of modern Western scales. The chromatic genus moved the notes closer together, creating smaller intervals, including what we would call half steps. The enharmonic genus, most distinctively Greek and most difficult for modern ears to appreciate, used intervals smaller than half steps, microtones that divided the scale into parts unknown in modern Western music. The enharmonic genus, with its quarter tones, was considered the most ancient and noble by the Greeks themselves. Aristoxenus, writing in the 4th century before Christ, noted that most people could no longer properly hear or sing the enharmonic genus, suggesting that musical taste was changing, moving away from the old refinements toward simpler, more accessible styles. This complaint about musical decline is one of the oldest recorded examples of a pattern that would repeat throughout history, each generation lamenting that modern music has lost the subtlety and virtue of earlier times. The modes, or harmoniae as the Greeks called them, were organized collections of tetrachords with different structural patterns. The names of the modes derive from Greek ethnic groups and regions: Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian. Later theorists added hypo prefixes to create additional modes: Hypodorian, Hypophrygian, Hypolydian. Each mode was thought to possess a distinctive character, an ethos. The Dorian mode was manly, grave, and dignified, suitable for cultivating courage and self-control. Sparta, with its military culture, favored Dorian music. The Phrygian mode was enthusiastic and ecstatic, associated with the worship of Dionysus and Cybele, often performed on the aulos. The Lydian mode was soft and languid, associated with luxury and sometimes criticized as effeminate. The Mixolydian mode was plaintive and pathetic, suitable for laments. These ethical associations were not merely metaphorical. The Greeks genuinely believed that exposure to different modes shaped character. Plato, in his Republic, written around 380 before Christ, argued that only Dorian and Phrygian modes should be permitted in the ideal state, as these cultivated the virtues of courage and temperance. Lydian and Mixolydian modes should be banned as corrupting, making citizens weak and undisciplined. Music education, for Plato, was not about entertainment or artistic expression, but about forming citizens with proper moral character. Aristotle, Plato's student, took a more moderate position in his Politics, written around 330 before Christ. While agreeing that music influenced character, Aristotle argued for a broader musical education that included all modes and styles. Young men should learn noble music to form their characters, but they should also be exposed to other types so they could judge and appreciate various kinds of music. Unlike Plato, Aristotle valued music's cathartic function, its ability to purge unhealthy emotions through their expression and experience. Rhythm in Greek music was organized according to poetic meter. Greek poetry was quantitative, meaning it was based on patterns of long and short syllables rather than stressed and unstressed syllables as in English. A long syllable took twice as long to pronounce as a short syllable. These patterns of long and short created rhythmic units called feet. The most common feet included the iamb, short-long, the trochee, long-short, the dactyl, long-short-short, and the anapest, short-short-long. These feet combined into longer patterns called meters. Different meters had different characters and were appropriate for different contexts. The dactylic hexameter was the meter of epic poetry, Homer's meter. The iambic trimeter was closest to natural speech and therefore used for dialogue and tragedy. The complex aeolic meters of Sappho created elaborate song-like rhythms. Greek musicians recognized several tempo classifications. The enopleon was a marching rhythm, steady and uniform, used for military songs and processions. The cordon was more varied and complex, used for circular dance songs like the dithyramb. The kata systema was free and flexible, allowing the performer to adapt the rhythm to the emotional needs of the moment. Instrumental music without singing existed, but was less valued than vocal music. The Greeks believed that music's primary purpose was to enhance poetry, to make words more memorable and emotionally affecting. Purely instrumental music was considered incomplete, missing the most important element, logos, meaning both word and reason. This attitude would persist in Western culture, with purely instrumental music remaining secondary to vocal music until the Baroque period. The few examples of instrumental music that did exist included the Pythian Gnome, a piece for solo aulos that depicted Apollo's victory over the Python at Delphi. This piece was divided into 5 sections, each representing a stage in the combat: the introduction, the challenge, the fight, the triumph, and the celebration. Even here, the music told a story, maintaining a connection to narrative even without words. Ornamentation was essential to Greek musical performance. A simple melodic line would be embellished with grace notes, turns, and trills, much like the elaborate ornamentation in later Baroque music. Different performers would ornament the same melody differently, demonstrating their skill and taste. Ornaments were never written into the notation but were expected to be added by accomplished performers according to conventions learned through years of training. Dynamics, the variation of volume, were probably important in Greek music, though our sources provide little specific information. The physical limitations of instruments would have created natural dynamic variation. The lyre, plucked with a plectrum, could be played gently or forcefully. The aulos, blown with reed pipes, could produce both soft and penetrating tones. In the theater, with thousands of spectators in an open-air venue, projection was essential, encouraging a more forceful style than would be used in the intimate setting of a symposium. Music permeated every aspect of Greek life, from the most sacred religious rituals to the most mundane daily activities. No major festival, no important ceremony, no significant social gathering was complete without music. To understand Greek civilization, we must understand music's central role in that civilization. In religious worship, music was essential. Hymns to the gods were sung by choruses and solo singers. Processions to temples were accompanied by instrumentalists. Sacrifices were performed to musical accompaniment. The Greeks believed that gods delighted in music, that beautiful songs pleased them and could influence them to grant mortals' requests. At Delphi, the religious center of the Greek world, where Apollo's oracle delivered prophecies, musical competitions were as important as athletic ones. The Paean was a ritual song, originally addressed to Apollo but later used more broadly. When plague threatened Athens, the citizens gathered to sing paeans, believing the god would hear their supplications and avert disaster. After military victories, soldiers sang paeans of thanksgiving. The melody of the paean was thought to have apotropaic power, the ability to ward off evil through sound itself. The dithyramb was another important religious song form, originally part of Dionysian worship, performed by circular choruses of 50 men, later also 50 boys. The dithyramb developed into an elaborate compositional form. Athens held dithyrambic competitions at the city Dionysia festival, with 10 choruses competing, one from each of the city's 10 tribes. The winning Chorgos, the wealthy citizen who financed the chorus, received a bronze tripod which he could dedicate at a temple, a public display of his civic generosity. In the theater, music was the primary medium of expression. Greek tragedy and comedy were essentially musical forms, though we often forget this when reading plays in modern translations that present only the words without the melodies. The tragic choruses sang complex odes between episodes of action, commenting on events, expressing the emotions of the community, exploring the philosophical implications of the drama. The chorus entered the orchestra, the circular dancing area, singing the parados, the entrance song. Between episodes performed by the actors, the chorus sang stasima, standing songs, though they also moved in choreographed patterns. At the end of the play, they sang the exodos, the departure song, as they processed out of the theater. Much of the emotional impact of Greek tragedy came from these choral odes, their solemn melodies, their elaborate poetic language, their ordered movements. In education, music occupied a central place alongside athletics and intellectual training. A well-educated Greek was expected to be able to sing the traditional songs, to play the lyre competently, to know the classic works of poetry. Music lessons began in childhood and continued into adolescence. Boys learned first from the kitharistes, the lyre teacher, who taught both instrumental technique and the classic lyric poetry of Alcaeus, Anacreon, and others. They also studied with the grammatists, who taught letters, and the paidotribes, who taught gymnastics. The Greeks saw music education as essential to developing proper character. a boy who learned the noble strains of Dorian melody, who sang the heroic verses of Homer and Hesiod, would internalize the values those songs embodied. He would become brave, temperate, and just. Conversely, exposure to improper music could corrupt character, making a young man weak, cowardly, or licentious. The stakes of musical education were therefore very high. In private life, the symposium was the primary venue for musical performance. These drinking parties, restricted to male citizens and their invited guests, followed established rituals. After dinner, when the eating couches were cleared and wine was mixed with water, the symposiarch would lead the guests in singing. Each man in turn would hold a myrtle branch and sing a scholion, a drinking song, often improvising new verses or responding to what the previous singer had said. Some scholia were traditional songs everyone knew. The most famous was the Harmonies song, celebrating two Athenians who had assassinated a tyrant in 514 before Christ. Every Athenian citizen could sing this song, which praised the tyrannicides as heroes who had liberated Athens. Other scholia were more personal, expressing the singer's own thoughts and feelings, demonstrating his wit and poetic skill. Professional musicians, both male and female, might be hired to perform at symposia. Aulos players provided accompaniment for songs and also performed solo pieces. Dancing girls entertained the guests with choreographed movements. The quality of the music and the beauty of the performers reflected the host's wealth and status. A symposium with exceptional musicians would be remembered and discussed, enhancing the host's reputation. Music also played a role in Greek warfare. Marching songs helped soldiers maintain formation and high spirits during long campaigns. The Spartans were famous for advancing into battle, singing paeans, their coordinated song intimidating to enemies and reinforcing the soldiers' own courage and unity. The aulos was used to keep time for the Spartan phalanx, ensuring that soldiers moved in coordinated steps, maintaining the integrity of the formation that was essential to hoplite warfare. At funerals, professional mourners sang laments, threnos, expressing grief in formalized patterns. These dirges followed traditional melodic structures associated with death and mourning. Female relatives of the deceased would join in, tearing their clothes and hair according to ritual conventions that regulated even expressions of private grief. After the funeral, an epitaph might be inscribed on the grave marker, sometimes in musical notation, suggesting that survivors should sing this memorial when they visited the tomb. Music competitions were major social events throughout the Greek world. Besides the Pythian games at Delphi, there were musical contests at the Panathenaea in Athens, the Carneia in Sparta, and numerous local festivals. Winners achieved fame that extended far beyond their home cities, traveling throughout the Greek world to perform, teaching students, receiving commissions from wealthy patrons. These competitions were taken seriously. Judges evaluated technical skill, tonal beauty, accuracy of execution, and appropriate interpretation of traditional pieces. Different competitions had different rules. Some required performers to play specific canonical pieces, others allowed original compositions, some permitted elaborate ornaments, others favored simpler, more austere styles. A musician's career could be made or destroyed by success or failure in these contests. Music's importance in Greek culture cannot be overstated. It was not entertainment or distraction, but a fundamental way of experiencing and understanding the world. When Plato imagined an ideal state in the Republic, he devoted extensive discussion to musical education because he saw it as foundational to creating good citizens. When Aristotle analyzed the causes of tragic catharsis in the Poetics, he emphasized music's role in arousing and purging emotions. For the Greeks, a life without music was barely a human life at all. Part 3. The music we've discussed so far represents primarily Athenian practice during the classical period, but the Greek world was vast and varied, with different regions developing distinctive musical styles. Sparta, for example, maintained a conservative musical tradition that emphasized simple, severe melodies appropriate to its militaristic culture. Thebes, Pindar's home, specialized in choral poetry. The Greek cities of Asia Minor were known for more elaborate, ornate styles that incorporated influences from Persian and Lydian cultures. The Spartans, famous for their military discipline and austere lifestyle, nevertheless valued music highly. All Spartan citizens learned to sing the traditional war songs, the songs of Tyrtaeus from the 7th century before Christ that celebrated courage and loyalty to the state. Boys in Sparta's rigorous educational system, the agoge, studied music alongside military training, learning that proper melody could inspire proper behavior. Sparta was also known for the Parthenia, maiden songs performed by choruses of girls. The poet Alcman, who worked in Sparta during the 7th century before Christ, wrote elaborate choral odes for female choruses, suggesting that Spartan women participated in musical culture more publicly than women in other Greek states. These Parthenia were performed at festivals, with different choruses competing against each other, celebrating beauty, youth, and the glory of Sparta. The island of Lesbos produced some of Greece's greatest poets, including Sappho and Alcaeus. Lesbian musical culture emphasized personal lyric poetry, songs of love and longing performed in intimate settings. The Aeolic dialect of Lesbos had distinctive phonetic qualities that influenced the island's musical traditions. Meters like the Sapphic stanza and the Alcaic stanza, named after their inventors, were closely tied to the sounds and rhythms of this dialect. Delphi, the sanctuary of Apollo located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in central Greece, was not a city but a religious site that attracted pilgrims from throughout the Greek world. Musical culture at Delphi centered on the worship of Apollo, god of music, poetry, and prophecy. The Pythian Games, held every 4 years, featured musical competitions that were more prestigious even than the Olympic Games' athletic contests. The Pythian Gnome, a composition for solo aulos mentioned earlier, was the most important piece in these competitions. Performers demonstrated their virtuosity on this traditional work, which depicted Apollo's slaying of the Python, the serpent that had guarded Delphi before Apollo claimed the site. The piece required exceptional technical skill and was also an act of religious devotion, recreating through music the god's triumph. Sicily and southern Italy, regions known as Magna Graecia, developed their own musical traditions while maintaining connections to the Greek heartland. The cities of Syracuse, Tarentum, and Croton were wealthy and cultured, supporting poets and musicians. Stesichorus, a poet from Sicily who lived in the 6th century before Christ, wrote extended narrative choral lyrics that influenced later tragedy. His works were known for their epic scope and dramatic presentation. Pythagoras, though primarily remembered as a philosopher and mathematician, established his school at Croton in southern Italy around 530 before Christ. His teachings about music's mathematical basis would profoundly influence Greek and later Western music theory. We'll explore his contributions in more detail shortly. The Greek colonies scattered around the Mediterranean also developed local musical traditions while maintaining their Hellenic cultural identity. In Egypt, the Greek city of Alexandria became a center of learning and culture after its founding by Alexander the Great in 331 before Christ. The famous Library of Alexandria collected manuscripts of Greek poetry and music theory, preserving works that would otherwise have been lost. Musicians from throughout the Greek world gathered in Alexandria, exchanging ideas and techniques. As Greek culture evolved from the archaic through the classical into the Hellenistic period, musical styles changed significantly. The classical period, roughly the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, was characterized by adherence to the traditional modes and rhythms, by values of simplicity and nobility, by the subordination of music to poetry. The Hellenistic period, beginning with Alexander's conquests in the late 4th century before Christ, saw the development of more elaborate, virtuosic styles. The so-called new music, associated with composers like Timotheus, Philoxenus, and Melanippes in the late 5th and early 4th centuries before Christ, was controversial in its own time. These composers added strings to the kithara, used chromaticism and modulation, gave greater independence to instrumental accompaniment, and generally prioritized musical complexity over poetic simplicity. Conservative critics saw this as decadence, a betrayal of traditional values. Progressive musicians saw it as artistic evolution, expanding expressive possibilities. Plato wrote disapprovingly of the new music, seeing in its innovations a dangerous rejection of the ethical foundations of proper music. In the Republic, he argued that changes in musical style inevitably lead to changes in social and political institutions, suggesting that musical revolution presages political revolution. This was not mere metaphor for Plato. He believed that the ordered structure of traditional music reflected and reinforced the ordered structure of the just state. Aristotle, writing a generation later, took a more pragmatic view. While agreeing that music influenced character, he saw room for various styles serving different purposes. Simple, noble music could educate the young. More complex music could provide relaxation and enjoyment for adults. Even morally dubious music had a place in society, allowing for cathartic release of emotions that might otherwise cause harm if repressed. Theoretical writings about music proliferated during the classical and Hellenistic periods. Aristoxenus of Tarentum, who lived from approximately 360 to 300 before Christ, was a student of Aristotle, who applied empirical methods to music theory. Rather than following the Pythagorean approach of deriving intervals from mathematical ratios, Aristoxenus based his analysis on what trained musicians actually heard. His elements of harmony and elements of rhythm established an approach to music theory that valued perception over abstract calculation. Aristoxenus's work also provides valuable information about actual musical practice in the 4th century before Christ. He describes the various genera of tetrachord, explains how different modes were constructed, discusses performance, practice, and ornamentation. His writings suggest a musical culture of considerable sophistication, with trained musicians able to perform in multiple genera and modes, improvising ornaments according to elaborate conventions. Later theorists continued this tradition of writing about music. Cleonides, whose dates are uncertain but who probably lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote an introduction to harmonics that systematized earlier Greek theory. Ptolemy, the famous astronomer who also lived in the 2nd century, wrote a treatise on harmonics that attempted to reconcile the mathematical approach of the Pythagoreans with the empirical approach of Aristoxenus. These theoretical writings preserved Greek musical knowledge even as the living practice of Greek music faded. By the early centuries of the Common Era, under Roman rule, Greek musical culture was changing, absorbing influences from Rome and the Near East, gradually transforming into something different from the classical tradition. The theoretical treatises allowed later scholars to reconstruct at least the intellectual framework of Greek music, even when the sound itself could no longer be heard. Gender played a complex role in Greek musical culture. Respectable women of citizen families were generally excluded from public musical performance, though they participated in religious choruses and private music making. Women sang laments at funerals, performed in choruses at festivals honoring female deities, and surely sang while working at looms or caring for children. But these activities were not recorded or celebrated in the way men's musical activities were. Professional female musicians occupied an ambiguous social position. Some were slaves, owned by their masters, and hired out to perform at symposia and other male gatherings. Others were foreign residents who worked independently, using their musical skills to earn a living. A few achieved considerable fame and wealth, becoming courtesans to powerful men, wielding influence through their relationships. One such woman was Lamia, mentioned earlier, who began as an aulos player and became the lover of Demetrius Poliorcetes, one of the successors to Alexander the Great, who ruled much of the Greek world in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries before Christ. Through Demetrius, Lamia gained access to political power, demonstrating that musical talent could sometimes transcend the limitations of gender and social status. we know little about how ordinary Greeks, those who were not poets or professional musicians or wealthy patrons, experienced music, but they certainly heard it constantly. Walking through Athens in the 5th century, before Christ, one would hear aulos players performing in the marketplace, children practicing scales in the gymnasium, choruses rehearsing for upcoming festivals, street vendors calling their wares in sing-song patterns. Music was omnipresent in the soundscape of Greek life. Religious festivals brought music to the entire population. At the city Dionysia in Athens, held each spring, the entire city stopped normal activity for several days of dramatic performances. Citizens attended the theater from dawn to dusk, watching 3 tragedies and a satyr play in the morning, a comedy in the afternoon, all of them fundamentally musical performances. This was not entertainment reserved for elites, but civic education available to all citizens, rich and poor alike. The dithyrambic competitions at the same festival involved choruses representing all 10 Athenian tribes. Each tribe selected 50 citizens to train for months under a professional chorus master, with expenses paid by a wealthy choragogue performing his civic duty. This meant that hundreds of Athenians directly participated in creating elaborate musical performances, with thousands more attending as audience members. Music was a communal activity that bound the polis together. The surviving fragments of ancient Greek music allow us to hear, however faintly, echoes of this vanished culture. While we cannot fully reconstruct the sound world of classical Greece, these precious remnants offer glimpses of how Greek melodies actually sounded, what rhythms they employed, how notation worked. The earliest substantial fragment is the Sappho's epitaph, discovered on a tombstone near Ephesus in modern Turkey. Dating to approximately the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, it's technically from the Roman period, but it preserves Greek musical practice. The stone bears an inscription, "I am a tombstone, an image. Sappho's placed me here as an everlasting sign of deathless remembrance." Below this, in Greek musical notation, is a complete short song with the text, "While you live, shine, have no grief at all. Life exists only for a short while, and time demands its toll." The melody is simple and dignified, moving mostly by step with occasional leaps. The notation indicates both pitch and rhythm, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct the song with reasonable confidence. The mode appears to be Phrygian, and the rhythm follows the meter of the text. The message is philosophical and poignant, a reminder carved in stone and music that life is brief and should be lived joyfully. The Sappho's epitaph demonstrates that Greek musical notation, while different from modern notation, was capable of preserving melodies accurately. Notes were indicated by letters of the Greek alphabet, with different letters for vocal and instrumental music. Rhythmic signs above the notes indicated duration. This system was cumbersome compared to modern notation, which partly explains why so little Greek music was written down. A more elaborate and fragmentary piece is the Delphic hymn to Apollo, discovered carved into stone at the Athenian Treasury Building in Delphi. Dating to around 130 before Christ, this hymn was composed by Athenaeus, son of Athenaeus, for performance at a festival honoring Apollo. The surviving portion includes both vocal melody and instrumental accompaniment, providing rare evidence of how instruments doubled or elaborated the vocal line. The hymn is in the Dorian mode, characterized by its grave, serious character appropriate to sacred music. The melody moves with dignity, the rhythm matching the dactylic meter of the text. The text praises Apollo, describes his attributes and deeds, and asks for his favor. The stone-carved notation preserves what was likely a performance piece of considerable importance, commissioned for a prestigious festival, performed before an audience of Greek pilgrims from many cities. Another significant fragment is the Orestes papyrus, discovered in Egypt and dating to approximately 200 before Christ. This fragment preserves part of a choral ode from Euripides' tragedy Orestes, originally performed in 408 before Christ. The music in the papyrus was probably not Euripides' original composition, but a later version, yet it gives us an idea of how Greek tragedy was actually performed musically. The fragment is highly chromatic, using small intervals and frequent changes of direction. The character is anguished and unsettled, appropriate to the dramatic context. The chorus of Argive women are terrified that Orestes, having killed his mother Clytemnestra, will be executed. The music's restless quality reflects this emotional turmoil. This fragment supports ancient descriptions of Euripides as a composer who used elaborate chromaticism to heighten dramatic effect. Several other papyrus fragments preserve bits of Greek music, most from the Hellenistic or Roman periods. These include hymns, paeans, and musical exercises. One interesting fragment is from a treatise on music that includes musical examples in notation, similar to how a modern music theory textbook might include staffs with notes to illustrate concepts. These examples help us understand how different modes and genera were actually realized in practice. A complete musical document from Antiquity is the Hymn to Nemesis by Musicologist, a Greek composer who worked at the Roman imperial court during the 2nd century of the Common Era. While this is from a later period when Greek music was already influenced by Roman taste, Musicologist consciously wrote in an archaic style, attempting to recreate the sound of earlier Greek music. His Hymn to Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution, uses a simple melodic style with clear structure, perhaps reflecting what Romans imagined classical Greek music had sounded like. Beyond these notated fragments, we have extensive descriptions of musical works in ancient literary texts. Plato's Symposium, written around 385 before Christ, includes a description of Agathon performing a victory song after winning first prize in the tragic competition. The dialogue describes the performance without providing the music itself, but it conveys the social context, the emotion, the reception by the audience. Athenaeus's Dihypnosophistae, or Philosophers at Dinner, written around 200 of the Common Era, preserves numerous references to earlier Greek music, including quotations from songs, descriptions of performances, and discussions of musical theory. This encyclopedic work, though late, collected information from hundreds of earlier sources, many now lost, making it invaluable for reconstructing Greek musical culture. Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, composed a dialogue on music that discusses the history of Greek music, debates between different theoretical schools, and the changes in musical style over the centuries. While Plutarch was not himself a professional musician, he was well educated in Greek culture and had access to sources from the classical period that no longer survive. From these fragments, both musical and literary, we can begin to reconstruct how Greek music actually sounded. The melodies moved primarily by step, with occasional leaps, within the range of roughly an octave or slightly more. Rhythms derived from poetic meter, creating patterns of long and short notes that corresponded to long and short syllables. Ornamentation was important, but not notated, leaving performers considerable freedom to embellish the basic melody according to their training and taste. The modes gave each piece a distinctive character. A hymn in the solemn Dorian mode would sound quite different from a song in the ecstatic Phrygian mode, even if both used similar melodic intervals. The ethical associations of the modes were not arbitrary, but reflected genuine differences in sound and emotional affect. Instruments provided accompaniment that enhanced rather than competed with the voice. The lyre, or kithara, would play before the singer began, establishing the pitch and mode, then would continue playing through the performance, sometimes doubling the vocal melody, sometimes playing short interludes between phrases. The aulos, with its more penetrating sound, was used similarly, but could also play extended solo passages. Performance practice varied by context. In the theater, with thousands of spectators, performers needed to project vocally and move in ways visible from a distance. At a symposium, With a dozen guests reclining on couches in an intimate room, performance was more subtle, allowing for nuance and delicacy. A hymn performed in a temple by a professional chorus would differ in style from the same hymn sung by a congregation of worshippers. These fragments and descriptions, incomplete as they are, allow us to hear echoes of a musical culture that dominated the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries. Greek music was not primitive or simple. It was sophisticated, theoretically complex, emotionally powerful, and socially central. Its influence would extend through Roman culture into the Middle Ages, shaping the development of Western music in ways that persist to the present day. The influence of ancient Greek music on later Western musical culture cannot be overstated. Though the sound of Greek music itself was largely forgotten after the fall of the Roman Empire, Greek music theory survived through theoretical treatises that were copied and studied throughout the medieval period. The modes of medieval church music, though different from ancient Greek modes, took their names from Greek terms: Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian. Medieval theorists believed they were preserving ancient practice, though in reality they had misunderstood the Greek system. Nevertheless, this connection meant that Greek terminology and concepts shaped Western music theory for over 1,000 years. The idea that music has ethical effects, that different modes and rhythms influence character, persisted through Boethius, whose De Institutione Musica, written around 500 of the Common Era, transmitted Greek music theory to the medieval West. Renaissance humanists returned to Greek sources, studying Aristotle's Politics, Plato's Republic, and other texts that discussed music's role in education and society. The Renaissance doctrine of musica reservata, the idea that music should express the emotions of the text it sets, derives from Greek theories about music's effective power. The doctrine of the affections in Baroque music, the belief that different musical figures could reliably evoke specific emotions, is a descendant of Greek ideas about musical ethos. When opera was invented in Florence around 1600, its creators believed they were recreating ancient Greek tragedy, which they correctly understood had been sung rather than spoken. While their musical style was entirely modern, their conceptual framework came from their study of Greek dramatic theory. Modern Western music theory still uses Greek terms: rhythm, melody, harmony, symphony, orchestra. The concept of scales and modes, though developed far beyond Greek practice, originates in Greek theory. The idea that music can be analyzed systematically, that it operates according to rational principles rather than mere arbitrary custom, derives from Greek intellectual culture. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scholars and musicians attempted reconstructions of Greek music based on surviving fragments and ancient descriptions. Ensembles like De Organographia and Ensemble Kyrillos have recorded performances of Greek music using replicas of ancient instruments and interpretations of ancient notation. While these reconstructions necessarily involve considerable speculation, they offer modern listeners a sense, however approximate, of what Greek music might have sounded like. The influence extends beyond Western classical music. The bouzouki, the primary instrument of modern Greek folk music, descended from ancient, long-necked lutes like the pandora. Modal scales in Greek folk music preserve elements of ancient practice, filtered through Byzantine and Ottoman influences. The idea of music as integral to communal celebration persists in modern Greek culture, directly continuous with ancient traditions. Greek philosophical ideas about music influenced not just Western culture but also Islamic musical theory during the medieval period. Arabic theorists studied Greek treatises, particularly those of Ptolemy, adapting Greek concepts to Islamic musical practice. Through this transmission, Greek ideas about music influenced musical development across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. The legacy of Greek music is thus not merely historical but living. Every time a Western musician thinks about scales and modes, every time music theory is taught as a systematic discipline, every time composers consider the emotional effect of their musical choices, The influence of ancient Greek musical thought persists. The sounds may be lost, but the ideas continue to resonate. Part 4. While Greek music was developing its distinctive characteristics, musical cultures elsewhere in the ancient world were evolving along different paths. Comparing Greek music with these other traditions illuminates what was unique about the Greek approach and what was universal in human musical expression. In Egypt, music continued traditions we explored in earlier episodes, traditions already ancient when Greek civilization was young. Egyptian music remained fundamentally tied to religious ritual and royal ceremony. Instruments like the harp, lyre, and various percussion devices accompanied temple services and court entertainments. The Egyptians did not develop the theoretical apparatus that characterized Greek music. Their approach was practical rather than philosophical, focused on maintaining traditional forms rather than analyzing underlying principles. Egyptian influence on early Greek music, particularly during the Archaic period, was significant. Greek traders and travelers visited Egypt regularly, experiencing Egyptian music and bringing back instruments and ideas. The mythical musician Orpheus was sometimes said to have learned his art in Egypt. Whether or not individual Greeks actually studied Egyptian music, the contact between the two cultures facilitated musical exchange. In Mesopotamia, the musical traditions we discussed in the first episode continued into the Persian Empire, which dominated the Near East during the classical Greek period. Persian court music was elaborate and refined, performed by professional musicians using various string and wind instruments. The Greeks were aware of Persian music, sometimes adopting Persian instruments like the barbitos, a long-necked lyre, and incorporating Near Eastern musical elements into their own practice. The relationship between Greek and Persian culture was complex, marked by military conflict but also cultural exchange. After the Persian Wars of the early 5th century, before Christ, when Greek city-states successfully resisted Persian invasion, Greek attitudes toward Persian culture became ambivalent. They admired Persian wealth and sophistication while fearing Persian political domination. This ambivalence extended to music, with some Greeks adopting Eastern styles while others condemned such practices as foreign corruption. The Lydian mode, one of the Greek modes, took its name from Lydia, a kingdom in Asia Minor that was absorbed into the Persian Empire. The mode's character, soft and luxurious, reflected Greek stereotypes about Lydian culture. The aulos itself, though it became thoroughly integrated into Greek musical life, probably originated in the Near East. Its double reed construction similar to instruments used throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East. Celtic music in Western and Northern Europe during this period left no written records, but we can infer something of its character from later sources and from descriptions by Greek and Roman writers. The Celts valued music highly, with bards holding honored positions in Celtic society. They played lyres and early forms of harps, sang long narrative poems recounting tribal history and heroic deeds. Greek and Roman authors described Celtic music as wild and barbarous, but this likely reflects cultural bias more than actual musical character. The contrast with Celtic practice highlights distinctive features of Greek musical culture. Greeks wrote extensive theoretical treatises about music, analyzing its mathematical foundations and ethical effects. Celts transmitted music orally, valuing memory and improvisation over written theory. Greeks organized music education systematically, with professional teachers using standardized methods. Celtic bards learned through apprenticeship, studying for years with masters, absorbing the entire cultural tradition along with musical skills. Roman music during the classical Greek period was less developed than Greek music, influenced heavily by Etruscan traditions. As Rome expanded into southern Italy and Sicily, bringing Greek cities under Roman control, Romans encountered Greek musical culture directly. They began adopting Greek instruments, learning Greek musical theory, inviting Greek musicians to perform in Rome. By the Hellenistic period, Roman elites were thoroughly Hellenized, speaking Greek, reading Greek literature, appreciating Greek music. Roman musical culture became essentially a continuation of Greek music, though with certain distinctively Roman elements. Romans preferred louder, more spectacular performances than Greeks, developing elaborate theatrical productions with large orchestras. The hydraulis, the water organ invented in Greece, became particularly popular in Rome, used at games and celebrations. Jewish music in Palestine and the diaspora communities throughout the Mediterranean developed according to its own principles, focused on temple worship and synagogue services. The temple in Jerusalem employed Levite musicians who performed psalms and hymns during sacrifices and festivals. These performances involved vocal music, lyres, harps, cymbals, and trumpets, creating elaborate sonic experiences that glorified God. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, Jewish musical practice shifted to the synagogue, where it became primarily vocal, instrumental music being forbidden in mourning for the destroyed temple. This vocal tradition would influence early Christian music, which also emphasized singing over instrumental performance. The cantillation of scripture, the chanting of Torah and prophetic texts according to traditional melodic patterns, preserved very ancient musical practices. Indian music, developing independently in South Asia, created its own sophisticated theoretical system during this period. The Natya Shastra, a treatise on performing arts written sometime between the 2nd century before Christ and the 2nd century of the Common Era, systematized Indian music theory, describing ragas, melodic modes, and talas rhythmic patterns. While Indian and Greek music developed independently, both cultures valued theoretical systematization and believed in music's ethical and spiritual power. Chinese music, with traditions extending back millennia, operated according to principles quite different from Greek music. The Chinese pentatonic scale, using 5 notes within the octave, created a sound world unlike Greek modes. Chinese music theory connected musical pitches to cosmological principles, with different notes corresponding to seasons, directions, and elements. The Chinese guqin, a 7-string zither, became the instrument of scholars and philosophers, valued for its subtle, meditative sound. These comparative perspectives reveal that while all human cultures make music, they organize sound according to diverse principles, develop different instruments, assign music different social functions. The Greeks' distinctive contribution was their theoretical approach, their attempt to understand music rationally, to explain it through mathematics and philosophy, to analyze its effects systematically. This intellectual approach to music would profoundly influence Western culture, distinguishing Western music theory from many other traditions that remained primarily practical and oral. Understanding Greek music requires imagining how it was actually performed and experienced, the physical and social contexts that shaped its sound. Modern concert halls, recording studios, and streaming services create contexts entirely different from those in which Greek music lived. The Theater of Dionysus in Athens, where the great tragedies and comedies were performed, was an outdoor venue carved into the southern slope of the Acropolis. At its maximum capacity in the 4th century, before Christ, it could seat approximately 17,000 spectators. The acoustics were excellent, the theater's shape focusing sound toward the audience, but performers still needed to project vocally and physically to reach the furthest spectators. Performances began at dawn and continued through the day, with audiences watching 3 tragedies, a satyr play, and a comedy, all in a single day. This was not casual entertainment, but civic ritual, part of a religious festival honoring Dionysus. Attendance was subsidized for poor citizens, ensuring that the entire polis could participate. The audience was not passive but actively engaged, cheering, hissing, sometimes disrupting performances they disliked. The performers wore masks that amplified their voices, acting like megaphones. These masks also had symbolic functions, identifying characters and allowing male actors to play female roles. The mouthpiece of the mask was designed to enhance vocal projection while also providing a distinctive, somewhat artificial quality to the voice. Combined with elaborate costumes and high-soled boots that made actors appear taller, the overall effect was stylized rather than realistic. The chorus entered through the paradoi, passages on either side of the orchestra, singing and dancing in formation. Typically 15 members for tragedy, 24 for comedy, the chorus moved in synchronized patterns, their collective voice powerful and their movements coordinated. A flute player, the aulate, accompanied them, standing at the edge of the orchestra. The music thus combined human voice, dance, and instrumental accompaniment in a multimedia spectacle. At symposia, the context was intimate and informal. Guests reclined on couches arranged around the walls of the andron, the men's dining room. After eating, when the tables were cleared, wine mixing began and the symposium proper started. The symposiarch, chosen from among the guests, directed the evening's activities, including musical performances. Each guest in turn would sing a scholion while holding a myrtle branch. The branch would then be passed to the next singer, not necessarily in order around the room, but according to social rank or the symposiarch's direction. The skill required was considerable. Each man needed to know the traditional songs, be able to sing in tune, and ideally improvise clever new verses. Failure to perform adequately meant social embarrassment. Professional musicians at symposia might include an aulate, typically a slave or foreign resident, who would play solo pieces and accompany songs. Female aulos players were particularly common, their presence adding to the evening's pleasures, though their social status was low. Dancing girls might perform choreographed routines. The quality of these performers reflected the host's wealth and taste. Religious festivals created yet another performance context. At the Panathenea, the great festival honoring Athena held every 4 years in Athens, processions of citizens, both male and female, walked from the city gates to the Acropolis, singing hymns and paeans. Musicians played throughout the procession, providing rhythm for the marchers and honoring the goddess with sacred sound. Musical contests at these festivals drew competitors from throughout the Greek world. Solo performers on kithara or aulos would play before judges and large audiences, demonstrating technical skill and artistic interpretation. Choruses representing different cities or tribes competed in dithyrambic contests. Winners received prizes, often quite valuable, and earned prestige that enhanced their careers. Wedding celebrations involved traditional songs sung by choruses of young men and women. The Hymenaeus, the wedding song, accompanied the bride's procession from her father's house to her new husband's home. These songs celebrated fertility, wished the couple happiness, and sometimes included bawdy jokes. The music was joyful and rhythmically strong, encouraging dance and celebration. Funeral laments, by contrast, were solemn and mournful. Professional mourners sang threnos, dirges, following traditional melodic patterns associated with death. These were highly emotional performances, with wailing and breast-beating. Female relatives joined in, their genuine grief channeled through ritual forms. The music helped the community process loss, providing structure for expressing overwhelming emotion. Private music making in the home is less documented than public performances, but certainly occurred. Mothers sang lullabies to children. Girls learned traditional songs from other women while working at looms or doing household tasks. Young men practiced the lyre and singing to prepare for symposia and to fulfill educational requirements. This informal music making, largely invisible in our sources, was probably where most Greeks actually made and heard music regularly. The instruments themselves shaped the musical experience. The lyre, held against the body, had a gentle, intimate sound. Its 7 strings limited the available pitches, unless the player retuned between pieces, constraining the music to a single mode or closely related modes. The plectrum produced a clean attack, each note clearly articulated. The sound was warm and woody, unlike the metallic quality of later harps or the complex overtones of modern pianos. The kithara was larger and louder than the simple lyre, constructed of wood rather than tortoise shell, with a more sophisticated sound box. Professional citharodes played standing, the kithara supported by a strap around the shoulder. The increased volume allowed performance in larger venues. The additional strings, in later instruments, permitted greater range and complexity. The aulos produced a completely different timbre, reedy and penetrating. The double pipes allowed for continuous sound, one pipe playing while the other was tongued and breathed into, somewhat like circular breathing on modern wind instruments. The sound was intense and somewhat nasal, capable of expressing passion and ecstasy in ways the lyre could not. But this emotional power made the aulos suspect to philosophers who valued rational control over emotional abandon. Modern attempts to reconstruct these instruments have shown both the possibilities and limitations of ancient technology. Replica lyres produce beautiful sounds, but lack the volume and sustain of modern string instruments. Replica auloi are difficult to play, requiring special techniques to produce stable tones. These challenges remind us that Greek musicians developed considerable technical skill to make their instruments sing. Behind the theoretical systems and formal performances were individual human beings, people who made music part of their daily lives, who struggled to master instruments, who competed for recognition, who found in music joy, meaning, and connection. A young boy in Athens, perhaps 10 years old, would walk to his music teacher's house each morning after breakfast. The kitharistes, probably an older man who had been a professional musician in his youth, would guide the boy through scales and exercises. The learning was rote and repetitive. Play this sequence of notes again and again, until the fingers moved correctly, until the plectrum struck each string cleanly, until the rhythm was steady and sure. The boy would also memorize songs, the traditional lyrics of Alcaeus and Anacreon, sung by generations of Greeks before him. He would sing these songs while playing the lyre accompaniment, learning to coordinate voice and instrument. His teacher would correct mistakes, sometimes harshly, music education being as demanding as any other form of Greek education. Discipline and respect for tradition were paramount. As the boy grew older, if his family was wealthy enough, he might continue musical studies, learning more complex pieces, perhaps even attempting composition. Most boys, however, would end formal musical training in their mid-teens, having acquired enough skill to participate in symposia and other social settings where musical competence was expected. Music was part of being a gentleman, like physical fitness or rhetorical ability. For a talented boy who wanted to become a professional musician, the path was different. He would need to apprentice with a master, perhaps traveling to another city to study with a famous citharode or aulete. The training would be intensive, hours of practice every day, perfecting technique, memorizing the traditional repertoire, learning to ornament melodies tastefully, developing the physical strength and breath control necessary for professional performance. Female musicians, who could never be citizens and participate fully in Greek public life, faced different circumstances. A slave girl might be trained to play the aulos, her owner recognizing that a musically skilled slave could be rented out profitably for symposia and other events. The training would be practical and focused, oriented toward making the owner money, not toward creating a well-rounded education. A free woman in a respectable household would learn music as part of her education, but her musical activities would be largely confined to domestic settings. She might sing at weddings, perform in choruses at religious festivals honoring female deities, sing lullabies to her children. Her musical life was real and meaningful, but largely invisible to the men who wrote the historical sources we possess. The life of a successful professional musician could be rewarding. A citharode who won major competitions could travel throughout the Greek world, performing at festivals and private celebrations, earning substantial fees, achieving fame that transcended his home city. He might be invited to perform for tyrants and kings, patronized by the wealthy, celebrated by poets. But success was uncertain. Many musicians struggled, taking any work they could find, performing at funerals and street corners, living hand to mouth. Social prejudice against professional musicians, seen as mere craftsmen selling their skills rather than gentlemen displaying natural accomplishments, meant that even successful musicians occupied an ambiguous social position. Old musicians faced particular challenges, as physical abilities declined, as hearing became less acute, as younger competitors emerged with new styles and techniques. Maintaining a career became difficult. Some retired to teaching, passing their skills to the next generation. Others depended on the generosity of former patrons or the support of family members. The Greeks had no social safety net, no retirement system, no musicians' union. Old age could be precarious for those without resources. The social networks among musicians were important. Teachers and former students maintained connections, recommending each other for opportunities, collaborating on projects, supporting each other in difficult times. Musicians who competed against each other might also be friends, respecting each other's abilities, learning from each other's innovations. The major festivals where musicians gathered were not just competitions but opportunities for professional networking, for maintaining relationships that spanned the Greek world. Musicians also interacted with other artists. Playwrights needed to understand music to compose tragedies and comedies. Poets needed musical knowledge to write verses that would sing well. Dancers needed to coordinate with musicians. These collaborations produced some of Greek culture's greatest achievements. The integration of poetry, music, and dance in forms that would influence Western art for millennia. The emotional life of musicians is harder to access. Did they find joy in their art, or was it merely work? Did they feel pride in their accomplishments, or anxiety about competition? Ancient sources rarely provide such intimate details, but surely musicians then, like musicians always, experience the particular satisfaction that comes from mastering a difficult skill, from creating beauty, from moving an audience with sound. Music provided connection. At symposia, men sang together, their voices joining in traditional songs, creating communal bonds. In the theater, thousands of voices might sing the paean together, a moment of civic unity. In religious processions, the entire population walked together, singing hymns to the gods, experiencing themselves as a collective body. Music made the abstract concept of community tangible, giving it sound and rhythm. For individuals in moments of joy or sorrow, music provided expression. A young man in love might compose a song for his beloved, or adapt traditional verses to express his particular feelings. A woman mourning a dead child might pour her grief into a lament, finding in the formalized structure of the threnos a container for overwhelming emotion. Music allowed expression of what words alone could not convey. The human element of Greek music reminds us that musical culture, however theoretical and formalized, was created by and for actual people. Behind every surviving fragment, every theoretical treatise, every ancient description, were individuals who lived with music, who found in it meaning and pleasure, who shaped their lives and their world through sound. Part 5. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration of ancient Greek music, let us reflect on the themes we've encountered and their significance in the broader story of Western music history. Greek music was fundamentally different from modern Western music in several ways. It was monophonic, a single melodic line without harmony. It was inseparable from poetry, with musical rhythm derived from poetic meter. It was organized according to modes that had ethical associations, different scales thought to cultivate different virtues and vices. These differences remind us that music is not a universal language with fixed meanings, but a cultural practice that varies across time and place. Yet, Greek music also established principles and concepts that would shape Western music for centuries. The idea that music operates according to rational laws, that it can be analyzed and explained through mathematics and logic, originates in Greek thought. The organization of sound into scales and modes, the analysis of intervals and ratios, the notation of pitch and rhythm. All these foundational elements of Western music theory derive from Greek innovations. Perhaps most importantly, the Greeks established the idea that music has profound effects on human character and society. They believed this not metaphorically, but literally. The modes you heard shaped your soul. The rhythms you learned influenced your behavior. The songs you sang formed your character. This understanding made music education essential, comparable in importance to physical training or intellectual study. This ethical understanding of music persisted long after the specific sound of Greek music was forgotten. Medieval theorists, Renaissance humanists, Baroque composers all drew on Greek ideas about music's moral effects. When we speak today of music influencing mood, of certain types of music being appropriate or inappropriate for children, we echo ancient Greek concerns, however transformed by intervening centuries. The professionalization of music, the emergence of musicians who made their living from their art, was well underway in ancient Greece. This created tensions that also persist into modern times, between amateur and professional, between music as leisure activity and music as work, between tradition and innovation, between those who value accessibility and those who value complexity. The controversies about the new music in late 5th century, before Christ Athens, sound remarkably familiar. Conservatives accused innovative composers of abandoning tradition, corrupting youth, undermining social values through musical experimentation. Progressives defended innovation as necessary artistic evolution, expanding expressive possibilities, responding to changing times. These debates recur throughout music history, from medieval disputes about polyphony to Renaissance controversies about dissonance to modern arguments about atonality and electronic music. Greek music was deeply social. It was performed at symposia where men gathered to drink and converse. It accompanied religious festivals that brought the entire community together. It was central to theatrical performances that were both entertainment and civic ritual. It marked life transitions, births, marriages, deaths. Music was not something you consumed privately through headphones, but something you experienced collectively, part of the fabric of social life. This social character meant that musical competence was a civic virtue. An educated man was expected to be able to sing, to play the lyre, to know the traditional songs. Musical ignorance suggested inadequate education, possibly even questionable character. The symposiast who couldn't carry a tune when the myrtle branch was passed to him faced social embarrassment. Music was too important to be left to specialists. The theoretical systematization of music, particularly the mathematical analysis of intervals and scales, represents one of Greek culture's most enduring contributions. Pythagoras and his followers demonstrated that musical consonants correlated with simple mathematical ratios. The octave was 2-1, the fifth was 3-2, the fourth was 4-3. Music was not arbitrary custom but natural law, expressible in numbers, part of the mathematical structure of the cosmos. This discovery had philosophical implications that extended far beyond music. If music obeyed mathematical laws, perhaps all reality did. The Pythagorean concept of the harmony of the spheres, the idea that celestial bodies and their motions produced musical intervals, reflected this belief that mathematics, music, and cosmic order were fundamentally related. This notion, however fanciful it seems today, influenced Western thought profoundly, contributing to the scientific revolution's faith that nature operated according to mathematical principles discoverable through reason. The Greeks did not make the distinction we make between art and science. Music was both, an art that expressed emotion and beauty, a science that followed rational laws. The musician was both artist and mathematician. This integration meant that studying music was studying the fundamental structure of reality. The divisions between disciplines that characterize modern thought were absent in Greek intellectual culture, allowing for connections and insights that are sometimes difficult for modern thinkers to achieve. The survival of Greek music theory, despite the loss of most actual Greek music, is significant. It demonstrates the power of written theory to preserve intellectual traditions, even when the living practice that generated them has changed or disappeared. Medieval and Renaissance musicians could not hear authentic Greek music, but they could read Boethius's exposition of Greek theory, could study the mathematical relationships between intervals, could understand the philosophical principles that informed Greek musical thought. This textual transmission meant that Greek ideas about music influenced Western development even after the Roman Empire fell, even through the so-called Dark Ages, when literacy was rare and cultural continuity tenuous. The written word preserved knowledge across centuries of disruption, maintaining intellectual connections between ancient and medieval, classical and modern. The fragments of Greek music that survive, the Seikilos epitaph, the Delphic hymns, the papyrus scraps from Egypt, are precious beyond their musical interest. They represent moments when ancient people chose to preserve something ephemeral, to translate sound into symbol, to record for posterity what would otherwise have vanished completely. Each notation carved into stone or inked on papyrus was an act of hope that the future might understand and value what the present created. Modern reconstructions of Greek music, performed on replica instruments by scholars and musicians attempting to follow ancient descriptions, cannot fully recover the lost sound world of classical antiquity. Too much is unknown or uncertain. But these efforts represent a reaching across time, an attempt to connect with people who lived 2,000 and more years ago through the universal human practice of making music. Even approximate reconstructions can move us, can suggest something of what ancient Greeks heard and felt. The broader significance of Greek music in human cultural history is its demonstration that music is not merely instinctive expression, but also intellectual achievement. While all humans make music, not all cultures develop elaborate theories about music. The Greeks did, and in doing so, they created tools and concepts that enabled future musicians and theorists to think systematically about sound, to analyze what they were doing, to transmit knowledge efficiently across generations and cultures. If tonight's exploration has sparked your curiosity about ancient Greek music, there are several ways you might deepen your experience and understanding of this fascinating subject. Modern recordings of reconstructed Greek music offer a starting point, though one must approach them with awareness of their speculative nature. The group Atrium Musicae de Madrid, under the direction of Gregorio Paniagua, recorded an album titled Musique de la Grèce Antique that attempts to recreate the sound of ancient Greek instruments and melodies. The ensemble Kyrillos, based in France, specializes in ancient Greek music, using scholarly research to inform their reconstructions. The Australian ensemble De Organographia, founded by Barnaby Brown, has also recorded ancient Greek music as part of their broader project of recreating music from antiquity. Their approach combines archaeological evidence, iconographic studies of vase paintings showing musicians, and analysis of surviving musical notation. While we can never be certain that these recordings accurately reflect what ancient Greeks heard, they offer imaginative and scholarly attempts to bridge the gap between past and present. For those interested in the theoretical foundations of Greek music, recordings that demonstrate the various modes can be helpful. Some classical music educators have created recordings that play scales in the Greek modes, allowing listeners to hear the distinctive character of Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and the others. These modern demonstrations, while not using ancient instruments or authentic performance practice, do convey the structural differences between modes. The poetry that was originally set to music can be read or heard in translation. Sappho's fragments, though incomplete, remain powerful expressions of human emotion. Pindar's victory odes, complex and demanding, reward careful reading. The plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, though we experience them without their original music, still convey the dramatic power that made Greek tragedy one of humanity's great artistic achievements. Several modern composers have been inspired by ancient Greek music to create new works. Harry Parch, the American composer who built custom instruments and worked with microtonal scales, drew on Greek theory in developing his 43-tone scale. While his music sounds nothing like ancient Greek music, his interest in alternative tuning systems and in integrating music with dance and theater connects to Greek precedents. Film and television productions set in ancient Greece sometimes attempt to recreate period-appropriate music. While these are often more dramatically effective than historically accurate, they can provide a sense of how music might have functioned in Greek life. The soundtracks, even if not authentic, can evoke ancient Mediterranean worlds, suggesting moods and atmospheres that help modern audiences connect with the past. For the academically inclined, translations of ancient Greek texts about music offer direct access to how the Greeks themselves thought about their musical culture. Plato's Republic, available in many English translations, includes extensive discussion of music education and its role in forming character. Aristotle's Politics, similarly accessible, treats music's place in the ideal state. These philosophical texts, while demanding, provide unique insights into Greek musical thought. The surviving fragments of musical notation, available in scholarly editions, can be examined by those willing to learn the ancient notation system. While this requires considerable study, it offers the reward of engaging directly with ancient sources, seeing how the Greeks chose to represent sound visually, understanding from the inside how their notational system worked. Museums around the world display ancient Greek instruments or reproductions. Seeing the actual size and construction of a lyre or aulos, understanding how these instruments were held and played, provides context that recordings and texts cannot fully convey. The British Museum, the Louvre, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and many others include musical instruments in their collections of Greek artifacts. Vase paintings depicting musical scenes offer another visual resource. These images show musicians performing, choruses dancing, symposiasts singing. While we cannot hear the sound, we can see the gestures, the instruments, the social settings. These images remind us that Greek music was embodied, physical, inseparable from movement and social interaction. For those interested in the mathematical aspects of Greek music theory, various online resources demonstrate the Pythagorean ratios, showing how string lengths and intervals relate. Some interactive tools allow you to experiment with these relationships, hearing how simple numerical ratios produce consonant intervals, experiencing for yourself the mathematical structure the Greeks discovered. The connection between Greek music and later Western music means that some knowledge of Greek music enhances appreciation of medieval, Renaissance, and even modern music. Understanding the modes helps make sense of medieval chant. Knowing about Greek drama illuminates the development of opera. Awareness of Greek music theory provides context for why Western music developed as it did, rather than following other possible paths. Continued scholarly work on Greek music regularly produces new insights and discoveries. Academic journals in classics and musicology publish articles analyzing newly discovered fragments, reconsidering interpretations of familiar sources, developing new theories about performance practice. For those interested in the cutting edge of research, following this scholarship offers ongoing engagement with a field very much alive. Ultimately, Greek music, however imperfectly we can reconstruct it, offers a window into a civilization that valued music as deeply as any in human history. The Greeks did not merely make music. They thought about it, wrote about it, theorized about it, argued about it. They saw in music reflections of the cosmos, keys to understanding human nature, tools for shaping society. This passionate engagement with music, as both art and philosophy, represents one of their most lasting gifts to Western culture. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through the musical world of ancient Greece. We have walked together through marble theaters and private symposia, through religious festivals and philosophical academies, through a culture that placed music at the very center of civilized life. The Greeks gave us not just melodies and rhythms, precious as those fragments are, but ways of thinking about music that continue to shape how we understand and create sound. Their modes influenced medieval chant and beyond. Their theatrical traditions inspired opera. Their mathematical analysis of intervals provided foundations for Western music theory. Their conviction that music shapes character echoes whenever we debate music education or worry about what our children listen to. If this musical journey brought you peace, if these stories from antiquity helped you find rest, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. Each Friday at 6 p.m. GMT, we release a new episode exploring a different chapter in music history. You'll find a playlist of all episodes, perfect for extended rest, allowing you to journey through the centuries of human musical achievement, one gentle episode after another. Next Friday, we will continue our exploration of Greek musical thought with an episode dedicated to one of the most influential figures in Western intellectual history. We will encounter the philosopher and mathematician who first discovered that music obeyed mathematical laws, who heard in numerical ratios the harmony of the cosmos itself. We will explore how this discovery shaped not just music, but Western thought for millennia. Join me then for Pythagoras and the music of the spheres. Until then, may the harmonies we've discovered tonight accompany you into peaceful rest. May the echoes of ancient lyres and aulos, of choruses singing in marble theaters, of philosophers contemplating the mathematical structure of sound, linger gently in your thoughts as you drift toward sleep. The Greeks understood that music connects us to something larger than ourselves, that it bridges the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal. In their melodies and theories, in their festivals and competitions, in their passionate conviction that music matters profoundly, they left us a legacy that continues to resonate. Rest well, dear listener, in the knowledge that music, that most ephemeral of arts, has connected human beings across vast stretches of time, allowing us to hear, however faintly, the songs and thoughts of people who lived when the world was young, when philosophy was new, when the great questions were first being asked. Rest well,